Every monitor in room 9 said the same thing, and every doctor who read them agreed. Senator James Calloway had signed the paperwork twice, his hand shaking so badly the second time that a nurse had to steady the clipboard for him. His 19-year-old son Ethan lay motionless behind a wall of glass. In 6 hours, the machines keeping him alive were scheduled to be turned off. Nobody in that hospital thought there was anything left to wait for. Nobody, that is, except a blind man 2 floors away who had come to fix a piano. Nobody had asked him to listen to a heartbeat. And who was about to tell an entire team of neurologists? They were wrong. Thomas. Reyes had been tuning the piano in St. Aldrich's Memorial Family Chapel for 11 years. A volunteer arrangement that had started after his own 6-month stay in the same hospital's rehabilitation wing. Following the roadside blast overseas that took his sight, and for a long time afterward, most of his sense of what his life was still good for. He had been a combat medic before that, the kind who worked by feel and sound as much as by sight, even when he still had it. Trained to hear the difference between one kind of breathing and another before a monitor could confirm it. When the blast took his eyes, it left behind, as if in some cruel exchange, an almost unnatural sharpness in everything else. His hearing, especially. Tuned over years of necessity into something the specialists who examined him afterward described. Almost apologetically, as beyond what they could fully explain. He tuned the chapel piano every 3rd Thursday. A small act of usefulness he'd built for himself in the wreckage of a career he could no longer do. And it was on one of those Thursdays, walking the familiar corridor toward the chapel with his cane sweeping in practiced arcs, that he passed close enough to room 9 to hear, through a door left slightly ajar, the particular sound of a family unraveling in real time, a woman's voice breaking mid-sentence, a man's voice going hollow and formal in the specific way voices go when they are reciting words they cannot yet believe. And beneath both of those, so faint that Thomas nearly convinced himself he'd imagined it, a third sound. A rhythm, something with a pattern. Before we continue, if you believe that kindness has no rank and grace wears no uniform, please like this video, subscribe to Kindness Tales, and share this with someone who needs to believe in people again. Today, Senator James Calloway had built his career on being the person in the room who did not panic. A reputation earned over 18 years of committee hearings and closed-door negotiations, and it had utterly abandoned him the night his son's car went off the coastal highway. In a rainstorm that had come out of nowhere, Ethan had been driving home from his first semester at college, the kind of ordinary drive a father doesn't think to worry about. And by the time James arrived at the hospital, his son was already in surgery, and by the following week, every specialist the family's considerable resources could summon had reached the same conclusion: catastrophic brain injury. No measurable cortical activity, no realistic path to recovery. The word they used, eventually, gently, was irreversible. James's wife, Caroline, had not left the hospital in 9 days. She slept in a chair beside her son's bed in intervals measured in minutes, not hours, and had stopped somewhere around day 6, being able to hear the word irreversible without her whole body going still in a way that frightened the nurses more than her tears did. James had spent those same 9 days doing what he did best under pressure, which was work the system, flying in specialists from 3 states, requesting second and third opinions, exhausting every resource his position could summon, and arriving every single time back at the same wall. The hospital's ethics board had scheduled a final family meeting. The paperwork had been drafted. 6 hours remained. What none of the specialists knew, and what James and Caroline could not have anticipated, was that outside their son's door stood a man whose ears had spent 11 years. Since his own injury relearning what the rest of the world had stopped listening for, Thomas stood very still in the corridor, cane motionless in his hand, and listened harder than he had listened to anything in years. The rhythm he'd caught was there again, faint, irregular, but present. Threaded underneath the mechanical rise and fall of a ventilator in a pattern that did not belong to the machine, he had spent 2 tours learning the difference between a body that had stopped trying and a body that was still, somewhere beneath the surface, fighting. What he heard now was the second kind, and every instinct built into him over a decade of triage told him so with a certainty. He trusted more than he trusted most things in the world he could no longer see. He knocked, and let himself be heard before he let himself be seen. A habit born of 100 rooms he'd entered as a blind man over the years. Aware that his presence needed announcing before his cane did, a nurse opened the door, already halfway into an apology about the family needing privacy, and Thomas said quietly, but without hesitation, "I'm sorry to intrude. I need someone to listen to something with me. I think there's a response happening that the monitors aren't set up to catch." The dark part of this story is that no one believed him at first, and reasonably so. James Calloway, exhausted past the point of patience, said, not unkindly, but flatly, that this was a hospital room, not a stage for miracles, and that his family did not have the emotional room left to entertain. False hope from a man who could not even see his son's face. Caroline, who had spent 9 days learning to distrust anything that felt like hope, because hope had betrayed her on this exact schedule for over a week, said nothing but did not ask him to leave either, which Thomas would later understand was its own kind of permission. The attending neurologist, called in reluctantly, explained, patiently, that spontaneous reflexive movement was common in cases like Ethan's and did not indicate cortical function, that what Thomas was likely hearing was exactly that, reflex, not response, and that raising false hope, this close to a family's hardest decision, bordered on cruelty. Thomas said, I understand why you'd think that. I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm asking you to record 30 seconds of audio from that room and let an audio engineer, not a doctor, tell you what's actually there. I could be wrong. I've been wrong before. But I wasn't wrong about the men I carried out of buildings by sound alone. More times than I can count, and every one of those times, someone with more letters after their name than mine told me I was hearing things that weren't there. Something in his voice, not certainty, exactly, but the specific, unshakable calm of a man who has staked his life on trusting his ears before, made Caroline finally speak. She said, "Let him listen again." 30 seconds. That's all I'm asking, James. 30 seconds costs us nothing. James, who had run out of every other option and had nothing left to lose by 6 hours. Agreed. Thomas stood beside the bed, cane set aside, and placed 2 fingers lightly against Ethan's wrist. Not for a pulse, but for the faintest resonance of movement beneath the skin. While he listened with the specific, total concentration he had once reserved for locating a heartbeat under rubble, he heard it again. A pattern, deliberate in a way reflex, never quite managed, arriving roughly every 11 seconds, matching. He realized with a jolt that ran the length of his spine, the rhythm of a question. He asked the room to go silent. He asked Caroline to say her son's name once, clearly, and then wait. She did. Her voice cracked on the single syllable. The room held its breath. 11 seconds later, the pattern came again, and this time, a resident with headphones on the recording equipment Thomas had insisted on setting up caught something. On the waveform that made her sit up sharply and call the attending back into the room without waiting to explain why. What followed was not a miracle in the way movies portray them. No sudden opening of eyes, no dramatic gasp. It was slower and more clinical and, in its own way, more remarkable. A re-examination using more sensitive monitoring equipment than the original assessment had employed, guided by Thomas's insistence that something specific be tested for, which revealed a thread of residual brainstem activity the earlier scans had missed entirely. Activity consistent with a rare and poorly understood recovery pattern that specialists had documented in only a handful of cases worldwide. It was not certainty. The doctors were careful, appropriately careful, not to promise anything, but it was enough uncertainty, enough genuine, unexplained signal to earn Ethan Calloway more time. And more time was the only thing his parents had been asking the universe for in 9 unbearable days. 3 weeks later, in increments too small to call dramatic but too consistent to dismiss as reflex, Ethan began to respond to voice, then to touch, then, on a Tuesday that Carolyn would describe for the rest of her life as the best day she'd ever lived through, to his own name spoken by his father, with the faint but unmistakable pressure of his hand closing around James's fingers, Senator James Calloway. a man who had spent 18 years being the calmest voice in every room he entered, found Thomas Reyes 3 days after that moment, sitting alone in the chapel with the piano he'd come there to tune, and said, without any of his usual composure, "You gave us 3 weeks we were never supposed to have. I don't know how to thank someone for that." Thomas said, "You don't have to. I did what anyone trained to listen the way I was trained would have done. I just happened to be standing in the hallway," James said. "That's not nothing. Every specialist we hired heard the same silence you heard something in. Why do you think that is?" Thomas considered this for a long moment. He said, "I think most people stop listening once they've decided what they expect to hear. I lost the ability to expect anything visual a long time ago, so all I have left is what's actually there, whether or not it matches what I was told to find," James said. "I want to fund something. Research, training, whatever you think would actually help a program built around what you just proved, so that some kinds of awareness get missed by the tools we currently trust most. I don't want a plaque with your name on it. I want the next family in room 9 to have someone like you in the hallway on purpose, not by accident." Thomas was quiet for a moment, his hands resting on the piano keys without pressing them. He said, "Then let's build it so it isn't an accident. Start with training programs that teach clinical staff to listen the way triage medics do, not instead of the monitors." Alongside them, 6 months later, Ethan Calloway, still recovering, still with a long road ahead of him that no one in his family pretended would be simple, sat in a wheelchair in the same chapel, listening to Thomas tune the piano the way he had every third Thursday for over a decade, and asked, in a voice still slow and careful with effort, what the difference was between a note that was in tune and one that only sounded close. Thomas said, "The same difference between a person who's really there and one who only sounds like they might be. You have to be willing to listen past what you expect to hear." If this story moved you, please like this video, leave a comment, and share it with someone who needs to hear it today. Subscribe to Kindness Tales for more stories of courage, grace, and the small human moments that change everything. And tell us in the comments, has someone ever refused to give up on you when everyone else already had?